Good afternoon. I'm Tom Gardner, a volunteer at the Storage Special Interest Group at the Computer History Museum. And I'm here this afternoon with Grant Saviers, who will continue his oral history, which, as it turns out, has been postponed since 2011. So good to see you again, Grant.
Thanks, Tom.
Grant has a long, distinguished career in the computing industry, mainly in storage, but also in personal computers. 30, almost 40 years with in total.
Yes, yeah, long time.
First at DEC, mainly in storage, and then at the end of his DEC career in personal computing. Then following with a number of years at Adaptec in storage adapters and storage subsystems. Mm-hmm. After which he's pursued a number of investments. When I look at your career, Grant, I see a remarkable growth in the revenues of the industries you've been participating in. DEC, I think, went, when you joined it in 1968, from 57 million
Yes.
to more than 14 billion.
More than 14 billion, right?
Yep. And Adaptec, when you joined it, was about 100 million and went to almost a billion.
120 million and just broke a billion, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in both cases you participated at a incredible rise and then left as things stopped rising, which I...
or maybe I helped them not rise. I don't know. It's, you never know when you look back. Those things which you said, which maybe weren't the right things to say at that time.
I doubt if it's causality.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But it's a weird correlation, but I think it gives you a unique perspective, which I'd like to share with us today.
Sure.
As to, the opportunities in growth and the challenges in growth, and you've looked at it in two big companies going from very little to very large,
yep.
And both companies don't exist today.
That's right.
So let's start with digitally.
Okay.
I think maybe repeating myself. We stopped when you left storage,
right,
to go to take over. Volunteered, I'm told.
Yes, Jack Smith, who I worked for, was really the guy who ran the company inside. He was the chief operating officer, even though not called that. And he worked for Ken, and basically almost everybody in the company worked for Jack. He said to me, "Time for you to move on from storage. Go hire your successor, and we'll find something else for you to do in the company." That was after about 21, 22 years in storage, building it from nothing basically to about a $3 billion business. So I recruited a guy named Charlie Christ. He actually did some consulting for us. I think he was with Cooper's. And he got to know the team, and the entire team had the chance to decide whether he was the new guy, and they agreed, they did. In retrospect, that was probably not such a great decision, but that permitted me to move on. And Jack really wanted me to move into the services business, to bring technology to services, but I didn't see the services business in DEC as going anywhere organized right. So I said no, but I think I want to run the PC business, which kind of fried his brain, because Ken was known to be ultimately quite antagonistic to anybody in the PC business. In fact, the VP who had run the PC business, Andy Knowles, it actually drove the growth of the PDP-11 for a long time, had left DEC in that situation, and said to me, "You're out of your mind. Ken will kill you within 2 years." I said, "Well, my equation is probably the board's going to dismiss him before he gets to me." Well, it was a pretty close call. Ken won only by 2 weeks. But anyway, that's the long and the short of moving into the PC business. But it was a really interesting challenge to join it.
You did this around February 1989?
That's about the right date, yeah. The John Rose was kind of the totally committed to personal computers from the earliest days of personal computers. he actually designed the Rainbow. And that was the Rainbow Pro and a PDP-8 architecture machine. It was kind of Ken's idea of architecture. You should have different computers for different applications, which didn't make any sense to most anybody but him. But anyway, that was round one of personal computers. Rounds two was something designed as a VAX peripheral called the VaxMate. That was in the mid 80s. First versions 80, 81, second versions mid 80s. So I joined in 89 when things were really rolling in the PC business. Dell and Hewlett-Packard and IBM were major forces at the time.
Just to back up for a second, you were observer in storage when the decision was made to enter the PC business with 3 unique machines.
Yes.
Gordon Bell describes that as be a leader or be a follower. And since at that time they didn't know what it would take to be a leader, having 3 architectures was the right way to go because you now have 3 horses in a race, not one.
I'm surprised at that. I would want to really verify Gordon said that because I think I'm not telling too many tales here, but Gordon left when he got into it with Ken, and he said to Ken, look, I don't agree with what you're doing in PCs, and I don't want to do that, so why don't you do that, and I'll worry about the rest of the computers at DEC. And I don't know whether, what happened there, but he basically, that broke the relationship between Ken and Gordon.
I'm pretty sure at least that was a strategic direction at DEC. Maybe it was Ken's and not Gordon's.
Yeah. Well, there were several folks that were driving the individual technologies, of course. Once you've got a PDP-8 group and you've got a PDP-11 group and you've got a x86 group, everybody's got their own horse in the race and they want to promote that horse. So either Ken went along with that or liked the idea, and it led to what I call one of the first billion-dollar disasters at DEC. It actually cost the company more than $1 billion to write off all that mess.
So now we're at early '89. You're now in charge of the PC business. Right.
Well, since Ken had, in the prior 2 generations, put a lot of his personal imprint on the packaging of PCs, the strategy that John Rose had evolved was to buy them outside, don't design them. And what he had done is contracted with Tandy, otherwise known as Radio Shack, but Tandy Corporation to build to our specifications, and those were built in a factory in Texas. I don't remember the exact location, but they had several factories in Texas, and those PCs were designed to DEC specs, DEC architectures, if you will. We had a couple of good architects in the PC group who knew, what the latest and greatest chips were that you could glue together to make a good PC. And that was the basis of the business. And the business grew to about $300 million. Just when customers said, well, I don't want to buy from somebody else, I want to buy the whole thing from DEC. Will you sell me some PCs? And at $300 million, I began to realize, and John certainly realized also, that a 22% gross margin wasn't going anywhere if we were going to get that business to be any larger. So we had to come to a decision about, are we going to make or buy? And so that was one part of that PC business. Probably the more important part was that we had this great product, internetworking product called PathWorks, which was kind of the only product in the marketplace that could tie together all the standards. We could interchange data between Banyan, Novell, IBM, and whatever Microsoft was doing at the time, which changed several times. And Apple. And we used to say there are more Apples connected to VAXes as a result of PathWorks than any other computer. So we were kind of the go-to when networking in those early days were little enclaves of different networks and companies. This division had that network, that division had another network, and DEC could tie them together. So that was a really important product, and unfortunately kind of got lost in the chaos after I left. But I thought that making PathWorks, really investing very heavily in PathWorks and Univac as the tie-it-together PC platform in the industry was the best strategic direction for us to go.
Is that an internally developed product?
Yes, it was entirely. Vijay Thacker was the leader of that, and had a software team of probably in the order of 50 people, and I wanted to grow it to like 3 times that size right away. But it was a nice product.
It came out of the which operating system?
Well, it ran on VMS, okay, and so it ran on a Microvax.
And you mentioned you were architecting the machines to be built by Tandy,
Right.
but these were PC compatible, BIOS compatible.
Yeah, they were totally IBM compatible. The Rainbow was not. It was kind of close, but it really wasn't. The Pro was an PDP-11 architecture running 11 software. In fact, the guys designing the Pro decided they wanted a new operating system when RT11 at the time was a far better thing than anybody else had in the industry, better than anything Microsoft had, better than DOS. And then the PDP-11, the word processing machine, the word processing software had existed for some time on the PDP-8.
So you now are running the business, it's getting straight, now growing.
Yes.
You're adding other suppliers, building.
Well, yeah, DEC had or let's say the European guys always wanted us to do something in Europe in terms of sourcing. They felt that local content was quite important. So we danced with Olivetti about buying Olivetti PCs and reselling them in Europe. And that really, given that we were kind of moving towards making our own, that didn't make any sense. We had no effort going in laptops, and Olivetti did. So we sourced our first, I think it was a 386 laptop from Olivetti, and it kind of worked. It wasn't a great product.
As my notes show, that was about May of 1991.
Yeah.
And
So,
any interesting stories in working with an Italian company?
oh boy, they like to eat and drink, I can tell you that.
Ivrea is an interesting town. Is that where you visited them? Ivrea?
No, I don't remember where the a guy named Peel, his last name is Peel, P-I-O-L, was the honcho, I think, in charge of either all computers or the PC division. And he wined and dined us, and we played golf, and, the Italian treatment. It was nice. But, we did that deal with them. And about the same time, or maybe a little earlier, I'm not sure exactly, I guess John had a pretty good relationship with Intel. And Intel, in that, I think the winter, spring of '91, had started to sell their own motherboards. They were packaging up their chips onto motherboards, and this really got HP and IBM and Dell in particular pretty agitated. So there's a very tense relationship between Intel and those guys at that time, I think. The upstart of that was Andy Grove said to DEC, you guys really are systems experts. We'd like to build server-capable motherboards. Will you help us out with that? Will you get involved? Well, that sounded like a pretty good opportunity. So we had this idea that we could build a PC workstation. So one of the very first 486 systems in the market was a workstation that was developed jointly between DEC and Intel. It was, the DEC name on it. I think the motherboard came from Intel. And we did, made some contributions to the architecture to make it a good server platform. Not server platform, workstation platform. and had a big display on it and the right amount of storage and the right amount of memory to be an interesting workstation. Since there were at that time some pretty powerful CAD platforms being developed or being sold on the IBM PC architecture by that time. It had been about 10 years since its launch, so it had gained some traction against the RISC workstation marketplace.
I'm curious, what sort of architectural enhancements to make it a workstation as opposed to a faster, bigger PC?
Well, you needed the right graphics. You need the right memory. You needed the right amount of storage at the right performance level. You needed the networking built in. So, those were not necessarily standard things on most PC. You could plug and play that amount of stuff in, but if you integrated them, you got a little better performance. I mean, we're dealing in the days of ISA, so it isn't a very hot bus by anybody's standards. So.
Okay.
So anyway, we did a big announcement in New York. Andy Grove came, and we were there, and so we made that product announcement, and that was kind of the building of a relationship with Intel. That was the big first step.
That was, I think, May 15th, 1991.
Okay, great. So the project started early 91, late 90, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that led to more conversations with Intel about how we could, now of course, there's the pro and the con of the strategy depending on where you're sitting in DEC, right? Excuse me. If you're looking at it from where the future of the computer industry is probably going, and have some suspicion that Intel's going to own most of the architecture of computers in the world, then getting on that bandwagon is probably a good thing. If you look at it from another perspective, say the VAX guys, you would say, well, gee, this is a threat. DEC was well into developing single chip VAX implementations at that time. But from my perspective, they were building our own fab, building our own chips just wasn't going to work. The economics just didn't work. If you sell 100 or 200 or 300,000 chips a year and you need to invest $3 billion annually, the arithmetic doesn't work. So anyway, so we said, well, okay, Intel's, wants to have a close relationship with us into the server market. And to do that, we need to build our own systems. And then to do that, we said, what business model should we use? And we analyzed IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Dell, and a couple others probably, and concluded that Dell was the winner in terms of the best business model. So we basically said, we're going to wholesale adopt the Dell model. We're going to sell direct. We're going to build everything in one factory. We're going to FedEx it to the customer. That way we can control quality. We can control obsolete inventory. We can build what the customer wants. And we can save a lot of money because we don't have all this stuff spread out all over the countryside in terms of dealers. So that was our proposal. And we worked that up and proposed that in the fall of 91. And boy, everybody thought that was a pretty good idea, except Ken. And so we were doing that battle, and by the spring of 92, it was clear that he was just going to say no or just going to fight it. And he did. And of course, he was the boss, so he won. And at that point, we had a management meeting, 400 people in the audience. Ken announces that somebody else is responsible for the PC business other than me. So we knew it was coming. And I think that was in March or April of 92. So at that point, the entire PC team basically said we quit. So I outplaced the people, and I said to my boss, Jack Smith, I'm done. My career's over at DEC. I don't want to go through any more of this kind of nonsense again, and set a departure date in June, which is when I left.
What was the alternative that Ken was proposing or advocating?
Well, he had a kind of a sycophant who said, we got to do the Burger King model.
Tell me what a Burger King model is.
Well, we got to make it, you can have it your way, and we're going to do it in 10 or a dozen centers around the country. And he said, well, this guy has no clue about manufacturing. I remember the old saying in those days, because HP would have the wrong part in the machine to sell it. We used to say, PCs rot faster than bananas. And everybody's churning all that inventory out in the field, and it just didn't make any sense. And plus, the quality was low as a result of local put together as opposed to a real factory. One of the reasons that we thought this was such a great idea for DEC at the time was we had no dealers, so we had nothing on the downside like IBM or HP had, and Dell didn't have dealers at that time. We had a factory that was basically empty in Phoenix, Arizona, that had been in the business of producing terminals in high volume. So they kind of knew the high volume, small stuff game. And we had a group called Accessories and Supplies run by a vice president named John Alexanderson. And John had $1 billion business of $2,000 average order size. They sold tape drives and paper and paper tape and mag tape and disk packs and odds and ends software and so on. So we had distribution infrastructure, we had factory infrastructure, and then we had the technology relationship with Intel. So it was one of the times in my career where you say, wow, we have stars in perfect alignment. This thing can really work. And then, Ken blew it up. So that was the end.
And did he execute the Burger King strategy?
Well, I left I don't know, I forget the date, but we can look it up, like June 15th, and the board fired Ken June 30th. So it was a Pyrrhic victory, if you will. So
he won the race by 2 weeks.
Yeah, he won the battle and lost the war. But it was clear to many of us at DEC that it was long past time for him to go, and it was a sad story, sad ending. Company was in deep trouble, out of cash, shrinking margins, shrinking revenues. I think you've got the chart of what happened. And I remember, a little going away party, and the storage guys showed up as part of the send-off, and I said, well, guys, you will be sold within 2 years. I said, I've seen this movie before. It's called Controlled Data. And, companies get into trouble. They get desperate for cash. Storage business is a good business. We got some good products. So Bob Palmer, who was already announced as the new CEO, will sell the storage business as among other things, which he did. So he sold part of the software business. He sold a couple of really good products in software. He sold the networking stuff. So that kind of decimated some of the core capabilities that DEC had, unfortunately.
They got acquired shortly after.
Well,
right?
96, I think it was.
96?
It was 4 years later that Palmer kind of ran out of options and sold the company to Compaq, right?
And they sold the storage business to Quantum in '94, I believe.
Yes, the disk business went to Quantum, and they just tossed in the DLT, which was a huge success for Quantum. I think I told the DLT story of trying to sell that OEM in my other interview where Ken said no, but
Yes, another opportunity.
Yeah, another opportunity missed.
So anything more you want to talk about the internals of your career at DEC before I ask you to be philosophical and go back and say, how did such a great, you saw the rise, you saw the confusion at the end, what should people avoid as they ride up these incredible ramps?
Well, I guess along the way you get to see that DEC grew at like 40% per year plus for like 10 years in a row. So we were the darling of Wall Street. You know, there'd been other like Xerox, and even before us it was Control Data for a while. And of course, when you do that, you build costs at an astonishing rate. You build inefficiencies because you're hiring people to throw them at the problems or the opportunities, however you want to look at it. And DEC did have a fabulous culture of taking individual initiative and ownership for making things happen. Ken deserves a lot of credit, as I said, for the success of DEC. He deserves a lot of blame for the failure of DEC. So anyway, those early days were terrific. Get things done. Low politics and high responsibility and great initiative for people who are willing to go make things happen. But you do breed some bad habits, and you do, and I think the time that Gordon left was a critical moment in that some changes in the profit responsibility and the business structure of the company were made around that same time. And those lost contact with the customer in a broad way inside the organization. Gordon's strategy was fantastic. We ran on that strategy for the next 5 years, but it was running out of fumes by 1987, 88. We stretched it as far as about we could stretch it. And it had been successful, and it was time to kind of set some new direction, but there wasn't the capability in the top management to think strategically about what the next step in the computer industry ought to be and how DEC should play with that. So we got very disconnected from the marketplace, aborted workstation efforts, and the VAX and VMS were great products. I mean, people still love them in a way. VMS is still alive out there in the world, interestingly enough. So those are great accomplishments, and there were a lot of infrastructure things in networking, storage, clustering, et cetera, that we did that were very innovative. But you can only go so far with that before what's happening in the industry has got to be part of your plan.
Note that 40% per year is a Moore's law growth.
Right.
And that, in my experience, is that sort of growth covers a lot of sin.
It does.
And then, if you have a 10% problem, you're going 40% a year, you're only growing 30% a year.
Right.
But when you stop growing, the 10% problem's big.
That's right.
And
it
so
is.
you talked about Gordon's strategy.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what you feel was Gordon's strategy that carried you on?
Well, it's on a chart here at the computer, because I'm sure I gave a copy of it to the museum. It's called the Big E, which talks about workstations, terminals, and PCs at the bottom level of the E. VAXs at the mid-range in terms of some price performance points of the VAX, individual processors, and then growing to the top level of the E with clustering and multiprocessing, and explicitly ruling out we'll never build a mainframe. And because that was IBM territory, and that was a bridge too far, if you will. When I read some of Clayton Christensen's, it really crystallized clearly for me what was wrong at DEC. We had a serve market, which was the departmental computing, the researcher, the scientist, the engineer, and the academic people. We made big inroads into manufacturing and control systems, and we had a good impedance match with those customers. We had what they wanted in terms of completeness of product, reliability of product, performance, price. Down at the bottom end, we were struggling. We were, when the Unix workstation came along, we couldn't really grasp with that, partially poisoned, I think, by Ken's infamous Unix is like snake oil. But those customers wanted less, they didn't necessarily want to buy a disk drive from us, but probably half of them would have. They wanted Unix. They didn't want VMS. They wanted kind of raw hardware performance and build something on top of that. And we never got that straight. And then we had the underserved market, where IBM was entrenched in the glass house, where you needed, 24-hour support. You needed all kinds of capable system management tools. You needed database technology. You needed large disk drives, which eventually we got to, so the plan was, and they had some pretty potent technology in ECL, water-cooled machines, et cetera. But Gordon said, we're not, that's just a bridge too far, and we should stay away from that. Now, I looked at Bob Supnick's oral history a bit ago, and he was Mr. Alpha at DEC. And when the VAX 9000 came along to build an ECL machine, I mean, everybody in engineering knew that the CMOS was going to wipe out ECL within moments of any possible ship date of a VAX 9000, which is exactly what happened. And so it was a totally wasted couple $1 billion to try building $1 billion machine, an ECL machine. So anyway, another big mistake that I think should be on Ken's shoulders.
Sounds like the middle child is a troubled child story in the space between the mainframe, where a ceiling on your self-imposed ceiling, in part because it was IBM's market, and in part because of technology decisions, because CMOS today is all mainframes are nothing but CMOS.
Right.
So,
we could approach, and that was the plan. The plan in storage was, we are not, the VAX 9000, in my personal opinion, was not a good idea, but I made sure that it wasn't going to have difficulties in the market because storage wasn't good enough. And so, part of a little bit how storage got into some trouble later was the fact that we tied a big part of our investment resource into making sure we had, the IOs per second and the reliability and the total system capacity to support, let's call it a mid-range mainframe machine that the VAX 9000 should have been. So that diverted resources a little bit from probably more of what we should have been doing in the mid-range. But anyway, c'est la vie.
Following that middle child analogy, the middle market being the test equipment, scientific, manufacturing. At the other end, you're being pushed up with these low-end products becoming as powerful as the mid-market products at a lower price. And, where do you move?
I think, there's plenty of room left. There's plenty of room. This networking, tying things together. IBM was nowhere with that. Microsoft was nowhere with that at the time. So there's plenty of opportunity there. And play in that marketplace. You may not get the margin. And we had, at the end, we had 60% margins in the storage business for hardware. It's not bad. And it was a $3 billion business. And at one point, the storage business generated more profit dollars than all the rest of the hardware businesses in DEC. So it was pretty good business.
60% margin. Seagate would be very happy.
Oh, sure. Lots of people would be very happy. Those are margins to kill for.
Yes.
So anyway, it was a great ride. It was a sad ending, and certainly glad that I took the opportunity to be at DEC. But it's kind of like today you say, well, we were the second largest computer company in the world, and everybody says, who?
And by the way, that 60% margin on a lot of your product was bought.
Well, towards the end, not a whole lot. Yeah, between the RAs, when the RA 81, 82, RA 90 came along, it was there was more bought at the low end than there was at the high end. But those weren't many dollars in revenue.
So we're pretty much at the end of your.
Right. So I leave.
You leave.
And I said, well, Jack did well by me, 24 years and a good career. And he said, well, we'll cut you a good deal. He did. And I made sure that my guys got out with a good deal. Excuse me. So I said, well, I'm just going to do nothing for a while. This has been traumatic enough, if you will, to ride this thing almost into the ground. So I said, oh, I'll paint the house.
Before we get into your Adaptec era, I'd like to back up a little bit and talk about some of the relationships you developed with universities in the late 80s when you're in the storage business, and in particular a little bit about Berkeley and the RAID meetings that I believe you funded.
Yeah, there were a number of university relationships. Probably one of the more important one was all the work we did in ECC and Reed Solomon with Berlekamp and another professor at Northeastern. But that was hardcore storage stuff. The subsystem stuff was part of the corporate university support program. Sam Fuller was the vice president of research at DEC. And he had research labs. He had 2 in California, and he had 1 in Cambridge, and 1 in the UK, and people in Maynard. So what he had done is formalize kind of the relationship with universities by coalescing it into supporting one major university for a program. I think it was around 3 years, so there were big numbers, and so MIT was the first choice, Carnegie Mellon was the second, and Berkeley was the third. And the Berkeley deal is typically half cash and half equipment, if you will. So that's how we put them together. And so the Berkeley totaled out to be $26 million, half cash, half equipment, is my recollection. Anyway, what Sam then did is basically recruited organizations within the company, engineering organizations, to sponsor a research program at that university. And so storage got involved with both database and some of the activities looking at storage systems there. Sam wrote the check, the company wrote the check, and then we had people interface with Berkeley to talk about what the issues were and hopefully absorb some of the technology. So at one point, I remember giving the fake $26 million check to Chancellor Tien at Berkeley, and then Mike Riggle, who was my R&D guy in storage, actually interfaced to the program. I remember that Randy Cass was there, and Mike Stonebreaker was the database side of it. So we were sponsoring both of them and their programs as part of that overarching corporate research program.
Do you know when you wrote the check or when you handed the check?
Oh boy, I'd have to look it up.
The first Berkeley paper publication was around December 1987. Does that help with a date?
Yeah.
Check before that or after that?
Well, I was still at storage, so it would have been 86, 87, yeah, somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, the Berkeley group development industry group, was that your process at the other
well, I didn't have
investments?
a lot of data, any significant connection to it except for the show and tells. Right. So, when it became time to impress the visitors with Frankenraid, I was there with Mike Riggle, and we looked at it, and we had long before that had decided that we were going mirroring with the HSC storage subsystem. And of course, EMC had decided the same thing, and we felt that was the better way for us to go, and concluded that while RAID 5 was kind of an interesting technology, it was going to take a while before any serious, capable RAID 5 systems would be in the market. We knew how hard it was to do mirroring right with automatic catch-up and swapping and drive replacement and everything else that goes on in a RAID system, that we said, well, RAID 5 is going to be a little bit more challenging.
You juxtapose two things that I think are about 10 years apart.
Yeah.
My recollection is DEC, if not the pioneer, was certainly one of the very first in true subsystem mirroring.
Yes.
And EMC started at the low end in 5 or 6 years later.
Could
and
be, right.
Didn't bring it into the mainframe market
Right.
until
well,
10
well,
years
I
later.
think we used, look at EMC drilling this big hole in the, because the customers would say, I want RAID 5. Well, they didn't know what they wanted, really. They heard, the press was gaga about RAID 5. We said, well, really, don't look at EMC. So we would kind of bring out that argument to try and buttress our selection. The other thing I think is, going back and looking at the RAID paper, because I browsed it as a result of you sending it again to me, the HSC architecture had a heck of a lot of horsepower to do things that I don't think, I don't know if they're done in RAID 5 systems. We could do out of order data transfers. We could do split transfers. We could do all kinds of things in terms of real-time sector by sector optimization. And since reads outnumber writes by a big factor in disk subsystems, you can play all sorts of games on a n-way mirroring that give you some really substantial performance improvements. I have a paper that showed that we were able to get 2 or 3 times IBM's IOs per second because of all those capabilities that we built into the HSC. Because we're using 2901 bit slices almost per drive to do all that optimization.
You have to be a little careful when comparing block-oriented architectures such as all of DEC and the variable record link architecture of IBM. Mm-hmm. When you think mainframe, IBM mainframe,
right.
You got to think count key data records.
Right.
And that actually was an invention that's not in the RAID paper.
Yeah.
And you couldn't do a mainframe replacement without it.
You could not do it, right.
That's why I really want to interview Moshe Yaneh,
right.
who's the guy who
had to deal with all that.
He brought that to
right.
EMC.
Yeah.
So you told some of the guys said you had delegated to the RAID support Berkeley in its activity. Did you name them for me?
Well, Barry Rubinson, I think, was one of the architects on the HSC. I don't know if Richie Larry was involved. He might have been. We should probably go look at his oral history and see what he says about it. Other than that, I don't know.
Yeah, personally, I know an industry consortium occurred because I know several people who attended various meetings.
Right.
And I'm just trying to reconstruct the history as best I can. Tell me something about some of the others. I'm curious about the ECC work, and which you characterize as part of hardcore storage.
Right.
How'd that go?
I might have covered this in segment 1 of the oral history, but Mike Riggle's strategy, he was totally committed to beat IBM, first of all, because he'd been at CDC and he'd, seen the ship go down at CDC. He said, well, we're not going to have the heads in media, at least in the short term, to beat them on the aerial density. So we've got to beat them some other way, and that's got to be subsystems technology, error correcting technology. We're going to have to deal with an error rate down around 10 to the minus 8 as the raw media head interface error rate. And oh, by the way, that was pioneered earlier with the CD-ROM. So he was involved, and a guy named Jack Brown, we brought the CD-ROM, made the CD-ROM a computer peripheral, made the CD a CD-ROM computer peripheral by working with Philips and Sony. Anyway, something you never get credit for, but it's how it happened. And so that was Reed Solomon, on top of Reed Solomon, and then the storage stuff was Reed Solomon.
I think we covered Mike's technology
Right.
thrust, but I don't think we talked about the relationship where the ECCI. I think we glossed over that.
Right.
So, how that worked was that the MIT group or the?
No, Burroughs. I think Burroughs was at Berkeley. I'm not sure. Quite
I think
where.
Burroughs at
Yeah.
Berkeley too. So
Right,
that's
right.
a third project at Berkeley.
No, that was before the Big Deal
okay.
project. So we're going back to almost 1980 now. So Burroughs was a consultant that Mike used, and then there was another guy, John Proakis, I remember the name now, was the guy at Northeastern who was also significant in the whole world of error correcting codes.
Okay, so you basically worked with these professors at
Right,
universities to bring the ECC technology. That was then, you did something different at MIT? Would you like to talk?
No,
that was not your domain.
Yeah, the Carnegie and storage wasn't involved at all with MIT and Carnegie.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so I think that pretty much
Right.
covers, now we've gone back to through your entire,
Regurgitated part of that.
regurgitated a bit. And anything else you want to say about digital before we segue
Well, I could
into-
say a lot, but it's kind of like,
we have
why
plenty of
bother?
time. We have plenty of time.
No, let's leave it where we left it. I think you've got the highlights.
I'm trying to get the lowlights. Okay, so it's now the summer of '92. You're painting your house.
Right, so the
You got a
phone starts
call?
to ring, right? So some of the top headhunters in California say, "Hey, we got something you ought to take a look at." So I said, "Well, I hadn't planned to go back to work right away. I'd like to take a few months off." "Well, you got to come up and talk to us." So I did, and two opportunities kind of moved along pretty quickly to the real job offers. One was Adaptec, where John Adler was the CEO, and Larry Boucher was the founder of Adaptec. Adler was the guy who brought real business leadership to the company and made it grow. And they had worked together at IBM. But Adler said, "Look, I want to retire." Made plenty of money, so I'm looking for somebody to come in as president and chief operating officer, and and within 2 years to take my job. And the other opportunity was in Milpitas, California, just around the corner from the Computer History Museum. And the other opportunity was in San Diego, and I'm trying to remember the name of the company. It was a tape drive only company. Cipher, but that's not the right name. The name began with
I think
an A.
Cipher and Archive
Archive. It was
became
Archive.
one. There was some litigation.
Right.
And I think as solving the litigation about that time, Archive acquired Cipher.
Okay, so it was Archive. And the guy who was the founder of Archive, I think his name was Howard, if I'm correct, said, "I want to hire a CEO. I want somebody to come in and be CEO." So, we did the dance, met the boards. It was interesting that some of the VCs were in common between the two companies. So it was kind of like Archive, Adaptec. Which one am I talking to with this board member? Farrell Sanders and Greg Reyes were two of the VCs involved. So
both on both boards? Or
no, one on one board and one on the other, but they both, Greg was still on the Archive board, and Farrell was still on the Adaptec board. But Farrell had been an investor in Archive or Cipher, and Greg had been an earlier investor in Adaptec. So tricky little situation. Anyway, my friend said, "Well, taking a COO job, bad deal, because the CEO changes his mind. you're toast, right? Why don't you take the CEO job? And you start at the top." I said, "Well, I think Adaptec's the better company." And so I took the Adaptec job. And then Greg Reyes calls me up about 6 months later, and he said, "Boy, you really blew it. We just sold Archive. You could have been there 6 months and made a ton of money." So,
Really, I'll have to research that, and
Yeah.
we'll put the right numbers in the record.
right. So anyway, I started at Adaptec as president and COO, basically running the business. And
So you walked in, you find the men's room, and what else did you find?
well, part you get the sense of the place, when you're doing interviewing. Is it aggressive? Are they capable? Do they have a good opportunities in the marketplace? Are they the leader? Yeah, they were the leader. So that was all good stuff. Adler's position was, don't do anything, you'll screw it up. So I said, well, all right, I got to make the numbers, right? That's my job. And so we made the numbers, and we did that for many, many quarters, making the numbers. Now the challenges were, the PCs are not standing still; they're going full bore in terms of architectural change. And when I arrived, there were some program transfer chips, and there was the mainstay of the company was something called the 1540, which was an ISA DMA bus product, and that was kind of the highest performance SCSI controller out there. We were competing with Symbios, of course, at the time, NCR Symbios, and they were always pushing us. But as the PCI, came to the market, I'm not sure what the dates were, but that was a couple years into my 94 maybe, 95. It was real clear that we had to be the leader in the PCI SCSI world, which we did. We were building our own chips. Not building our own chips, we were designing our own chips, having them fabbed. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, was the company that made them for us, most of them. We had a couple other suppliers. We had a good relationship with TSMC. We had a couple other businesses. The SCSI business is the biggest and most profitable. We were making disk drive controller chips for Maxtor and Connor and for Seagate. So we had a pretty capable, not drive development team, but everything but the mechanics development, doing all the data paths and the SCSI interface, or whatever the drive interface was. So that business, it was a dog food business. It was really, really difficult, building custom ASICs. You're hoping that the customer's product will be successful. You're making a lot of investment, and so it was a difficult business. We also had a printer controller business. We actually made the imager, the raster imaging guts for the Apple laser writer, and I was just fascinated by Apple's business model. They drop shipped from, I guess it was Fuji or from Ricoh or Canon. I guess it was Canon. They bought the Canon engine with no controller, and they told us when to ship the controller, the power cord, and the manuals in a box for the customer to put it into the printer. So they never touched the printer at all. It was a brilliant business model. No inventory, no payables, all receivables.
Controller separate cable to the.
Yeah, we made we had it in a cardboard box. The customer could slip the controller into the Canon printer and hook up the power cord.
Literally slipped inside the printer.
Yes.
You opened a port, slipped it in, closed the door.
Right. So that was kind of fun.
That is an amazing business model.
Yeah. So, of course, they went on and I think they decided to do the controllers themselves. So that kind of business withered away, and in fact, we officially got out of that business. So SCSI was the mainstream, but it was clear that there's all kinds of other stuff happening in terms of I/O interfaces. So Apple was pushing us very hard to do 1394. They really wanted FireWire to be their I/O interface. So we did FireWire chips.
Internally or
Yeah, no, internally. We designed them, scratch designs. We had a pretty big semiconductor CAD and process team. We had about 100 people working on CAD tools and process verification with TSMC. TSMC looked at us as a very technically competent fabless company. We would interact with them on their new shrink, whatever the new nanometers or microns were at the time, and help them debug that in terms of getting the models right. So then Fiber Channel came along, and it was quite clear that we had to be the leader in fiber channel. So started to make the investment in terms of a very high performance fiber channel host adapter chip. Then we started to view the company as the high performance interconnect company. So the proposal was we're not the SCSI company. We want to be the high performance I/O. Adler tried to make the term IOware work, but it never worked. And so we were making investments in things that we thought were going to work. We did dive into ATM, asynchronous transfer mode. Everybody said, well, this is the next big thing after Ethernet. Ethernet was 100, struggling to get to 100 meg. ATM promised 150 and 300, et cetera. So we developed ATM chips.
Also internally?
Yes, right. All the host adapter ATM chips. And a little apocryphal story there. I learned something about product names. The woman who was the product manager for the ATM line, we had something like 12 products, various performance levels, various PC side buses, various numbers of chips, number of ports of ATM on the board. She called it the Niobe product line because this Greek goddess named Niobe had 12 children. And she was extraordinarily proud of these 12 children. Well, our product manager was extraordinarily proud of her 12 products. What I learned later was the boastfulness of Niobe so irritated the other gods that they had all 12 children killed. So, and that was the fate of the ATM product line. ATM was a bust into Ethernet 1. So, bad strategy. Good execution, bad strategy. It's another lesson in don't bet against the incumbents.
That was an interesting era when, basically we were going from parallel to serial.
Yes.
Right. And there were lots of technologies out there that could do it. And Ethernet won in a certain extent, sure.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So anyway, on the SCSI side, we're doing fast. We're doing PCI, we're doing wide PCI, we're doing, fast PCI. We're doing the other side. We're doing SCSI. We're doing fast SCSI, wide SCSI, fast wide SCSI, and then one of the guys came up with LVDS, the low voltage differential signaling, and that took us to ultra SCSI, and I think that was around 300 megabytes per second. Pretty rip roaring data rates. So, but that was about the end of SCSI. It was not much to do in a parallel bus, as you note beyond that.
Then we went to serial SCSI.
Right, which was basically on some other networking backbone. Right.
I actually back up a second, and so you've been on both sides of the subsystem with the disk drive development, down to the recording codes and the signal processing up to the HSC attachments. I always wondered how it worked inside a controller company when you're doing the low-level drive stuff, but not doing the drives. How'd that work out? How do you really get the data separator to work that you can sell to somebody else who's then going to use it in their drive?
I think I drove, and when DEC drove the industry to get the data separator in the drive. We said, we're not going to muck around with technology transitions. And the whole point of the mass bus way back and the whole point of then the storage interconnect was the real technology hardcore stuff is in the disk drive. And with LSI, you're not paying much of a penalty for doing that compared to the old IBM architectures, or half of it's in the controller and half of it's in the disk drive. Of course, SCSI was another embodiment of that.
Well, but now the key electronics are in the chip, which is made by Adaptec and sold to Seagate. So
Yes.
So Seagate's got to, depend upon somehow you've got to have that intimate knowledge at Adaptec to deliver a chip to Seagate or any of the hard drive companies in a way that it was a hard problem to solve.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I wish I'd saved this letter because it was so off the curve. Tom Mitchell wrote me a letter saying, "Thanks for saving our butt in designing that disk drive for us." So we actually did most of the, except we didn't do the heads and the media and the spindle and that stuff, but the electronics, we actually produced a prototype board for him to make that disk drive.
Sure.
The whole thing. So we had the capability of designing the full suite of disk drive electronics.
Right, which, you didn't have. You didn't have. Maybe you did have the head and disk spinners, so you can drive your circuits and test them. So I mean, you're a disk drive company without the mechanics.
That's right. And Seagate would call us up, say, we need the proto chip. We don't care if only 95% of it works, because we want to get the breadboard to work. You say, okay, we'll do the best we can.
But that may have been a good business because the hardware never got 60% margins.
True, and we didn't have to, we had like 30% margins in that business. So it was a business that allowed us to build a pretty capable semiconductor design team. Okay, with the CAD tools and the process verification with TSMC and the modeling, the individual circuit modeling verification, et cetera. In retrospect, I should have exited that business more forcefully, because the leverage we had with TMC, I think, would have been sustained without it.
I mean, 400 million chips a year is a
big number.
Should get their attention.
Right.
It's
Well, we were a wafer buyer. We were not buying chips. We were buying wafers. So
Oh, really?
we had our own semiconductor test capability. So we had a whole slice and dice wafer. Wafers came to Adaptec. We processed them in terms of chip testing. We then sent them out to a sent them out to a subcontractor to package them, and then we tested them again in the package. So we were, when you think about fabless semiconductor companies, that's pretty far into the fab, if you will. Right.
But that's, at that time, I think the hard disk drive industry was making 20% gross margin.
Could be. Yeah.
And Seagate had all of it.
Yeah.
And, but they're buying a chip from you and you're having a much higher margin.
Yes.
And ultimately it's still that way today. To me, that's strange. I mean,
well, it's yes and no. I very off topic, but I had studied when Dak said we want to be in the services business. I'd studied the return on equity across all the hierarchies of the computer industry. It was guys at the bottom and the guys at the top that made the money. So it was Intel and Microsoft, and then it was some of the not service companies, but it was like Oracle and people who had software products that they could lock in a customer with. And in the middle, it was much more difficult.
Actually, my experience is the service business is sometimes the most profitable business in a company, and margins are approaching 50%.
Yeah.
If you can get service density up to keep your inventory costs low and your utilization high.
The fixed break business in service was going to go away because products were going to get so reliable they're either going to be, and so cheap they're going to be thrown away, or they're not going to break. My view of the service business is you've got to have a cornerstone product technology base in order to really be successful. There's probably some counterexamples to that, but I think that's more true than not. So anyway, Adaptec's growing like crazy. We're kind of a nice momentum play in Wall Street. We're making 60% gross margins and 22% profit, and we get to have some fun. So the finance guys, the CFO came to me and said, why don't we do a really interesting annual report, since people don't know what we're doing. So we had some proposals, and this manga, Japanese manga idea won, and it's basically cartoons explaining what we do, and Wall Street loved it. The guy said, "Oh, I now know what you guys are doing. I couldn't figure it out before." So that was a real groundbreaker in terms of annual reports. Nobody had ever done anything like that before. So when you're on top and the margins are good and the momentum is good, you can have fun. Then we followed it up with this one, ABCD, all about being connected to data, because that was the theme that was evolving in terms of we're doing everything in high performance I/O. So we had some shunts that didn't work out, but between SCSI, FireWire, then Ethernet, ATM being a bust, then Ethernet, and then fiber channel, it was where we're going. The PCI SCSI stuff is extremely successful, and a big part of our revenue was called the shrink wrap business. You could go to Fry's, and you could buy Adaptec boxes with host adapters in them, and there was 10 different products on the shelf at Fry's, or you could go to Computerland or whatever the other a la carte computer stores were, and the Adaptec products were there on the shelves as shrink wrap boxes, and so there was a pretty good retail business that we had, and it was a good profit maker.
Principally SCSI for upgrading systems. I mean, by that time, most PCs came with ATA embedded on the motherboard.
Not quite then, but the ATA was still not capable for a while of tape drives and CD-ROMs. So a lot of the business, or people wanted a high-performance disk drive, so they were going to buy a SCSI drive. So the performance wasn't there in the magnetic storage, and the capability wasn't there in the CD-ROM and tape area. We had FireWire products at Fry's, so people could add that onto their PC with various buses.
FireWire being external for Mac, probably.
Well, there were FireWire peripherals out in the marketplace that people wanted to connect to, or and video was coming in terms of home video editing. So I think Sony was big in terms of promoting FireWire on their cameras. Not so much anymore, but that was a driver also.
So that was good business in this middle 90s period.
Yes, very good business. And it's how we got into trouble later, because we kind of got blindsided by how quickly the basic volume drivers there, CD-ROMs and tape drives, shifted to whatever the latest ATA was.
A TAPI.
Right.
Oh, good point. I mean, a TAPI
solved that problem.
Everything tape drives,
Right.
Low-end tape drives,
Yep.
CD-ROMs, DVDs, everything became available in a TAPI right about mid to late 90s.
Well, it was the fall of 1997, exactly. I can't pin it down more accurately than that, but it was right around then when it happened. Well, that's the time when the PC makers started shipping it. Okay,
right.
And the peripheral guys had some stuff available that attached. So, we were watching that, but apparently not watching that carefully enough, and that's what caused a bad quarter in Q4 calendar 1997.
Bad quarter in terms of inventory write-off?
No, it's just revenue didn't hit the goal.
Okay.
Profit was terrific, but revenue didn't hit the goal, and we got beat up terribly for that. So anyway, and before that, we kind of knew that SCSI was great. We're going to keep pursuing SCSI as hard as we can in terms of making it a high-performance interface. But fiber channel has too much traction to be ignored. The workstation community is gaga over fiber channel. Systems manufacturers, it was interesting, Dell basically told us, we're going to go FireWire, period. So if you don't do FireWire, we're going to go away as a customer. So we said, we're doing FireWire. and Hewlett-Packard had a FireWire, did I say FireWire? Fiber channel. We're going fiber channel. Hewlett-Packard was actually developing a fiber channel chip. They took a look at ours and said, well, we'll get out of the fiber channel chip business with making a strategic deal. So we had that on the table. We had the Dell ultimatum, basically. So fiber channel was mainstream, and I even talked to Brocade directors at that time, and fiber channel was still not living up to the hype. And they said, well, we'll sell you Brocade for what we got in it, $50 million. And for various reasons, I didn't pursue that. But there was going to be a vibrant fiber channel market for sure. Whether it's going to be long term or not, history now says it was not, but it was certainly real in that time frame and was going to go somewhere in those selected markets. So we made the commitment to be the best at fiber channel, and we did a pretty good job of that. So now we come up to, I think we covered a lot of the other technologies. Companies get to about $1 billion.
Oh, I don't think you've covered RAID.
RAID, okay. Well, that's right, let's back up. So part of what are you going to do, two things. What are you going to do when SCSI slows down? And what are you going to do to get bigger than $1 billion? So Ethernet, FireWire, fiber channel. Ethernet opportunity was pretty good, except Intel had just killed the Ethernet guys down around the corner. I forget the name of the Ethernet host adapter company. But anyway, Ethernet was only looking like it was going to make any sense at all in the server market. So it was going to be a limited market. But that's where we went. And so I said, well, know something about subsystems. One of the guys I had casually known at DEC, Rich Napolitano, had designed a RAID subsystem with some rather interesting capabilities with a group of ex-DEC guys in New Hampshire. And the company's name was, you have it, I think.
Kinesis?
Data Kinesis.
Data Kinesis,
right. So somebody put me in touch with Rich, and we talked, and said, wow, he's got some really interesting ideas. He's not only built a RAID system, he's built multi-drive data virtualization into this thing. So he can virtualize C drive across as many drives as you want, which at that time Microsoft couldn't do, which is kind of interesting issue in the server market. You get 100 megs and that's it. So I said, wow, that's a really cool idea. And so we got together, we bought the company. And Rich came on board with the team, and they pursued developing this virtualization controller, RAID subsystem, I should say. And we went around, and we went to Hewlett-Packard, we went to IBM, we went to Dell, and they said, wow, this is really cool. Let's take a look at it. In the end, not one of them would sign up for the kind of how far ahead that was. It was too big a leap, they thought, for their customers to take on to that level of technology advancement. Interesting
Really?
comment. So we retrenched, we backed it back, and we said, okay, we're going to just build RAID controllers. If that's what you want, we'll build a RAID controller.
So the RAID controller presented itself as just a big disk drive.
In terms of the virtualization, yes. Right.
Well, without virtualization,
Right.
If you put a RAID 5 of 4 1 gig drives, it's a 4
Right.
gig drive to the system, no virtualization.
Yes.
And the innovation was the way to make a lump of storage looked like a bunch of different drives,
Right.
block-oriented drives.
Right. This block oriented, sure. It was
Yeah.
SCSI. So that became the cornerstone of a RAID program at Adaptec. So now we're into kind of the spring of,
But you're not authoring virtualization in that sense. You're
Yes, that's
just
correct.
another RAID,
just another RAID box. Right.
just another,
Right.
just another RAID bunch of drives.
Right. So the effort then became, how do you package? You needed a RAID-friendly slot box system with redundant power and all other stuff that's required in a RAID box, and
Hot
that-
swapping,
hot swapping, yeah, everything. Yeah.
all the goodies.
All the bells and whistles, right? All the goodies. So that development team was started in Longmont, and so they became the RAID hardware engine makers, and so that was underway.
So this was basically a SCSI box with a controller and slots for a bunch of drives,
Right.
and it presented itself as just a drive,
Right.
C drive, D drive, whatever, in
Right.
the Microsoft world or whatever. So more or less the same thing in any world. It's just a
Yes.
large block of storage.
Yes. Right. Right. So we then started.
I mean, I find that really amazing that presented the opportunity for virtualization. Your customers failed to recognize it.
Well, I think some of the technical people understood it and saw the power in it, because obviously it was hugely successful later in the marketplace. But sometimes the early guy just collects the arrows. The marketing folks say, well, how do we sell this? So much in the PC world was cookie cutter like everybody else, right? And there's little tweaks in terms of the numbers games in PCs. If you really innovate, what does that mean? Or maybe they had some magic insight that we didn't have, or Microsoft told them don't do that, or I don't, it's all kinds of dynamics. in the PC
Partitioning
business.
was known. I mean, that's sort of
Right.
the next step. That's
Yeah. Right.
interesting
Yeah.
oversight.
Yeah. Probably be better to get some of the detailed history from Rich, but somebody probably should be interviewed, do an oral history for him, because he was at EMC for a long time, ran a big part of EMC. So anyway,
Business do well. I mean, it was sort of the end of your
yes,
career
it was,
there.
it was extremely competitive in terms of landing a big systems company. We decided we would also go direct into the system builders marketplace, which we had a good relationship with, Adaptec, because we innovated with a 5-year warranty, no questions asked, send it back. We had the best software. We had the best total systems capability. We had hundreds of different systems running day and night, testing products for compatibility. We had unmatched data reliability. So the local system integrators, when you wanted to call up your guy down the street and have him put some PCs into your office with a server, that was a big market for us, dealing direct with them. So we said, okay, we'll build a RAID-capable direct sales force for that. So that was part of the plan. Since we had not sold, we'd sold through distributors and we sold through retail, but we had not sold direct to system builders, system integrators.
So you added bag-carrying salespeople.
Right. So then a big event. The parent of Symbiosis shows up on our doorstep and says, first guy with the $750-some million check gets Symbiosis. So I said, wow, that's interesting. We have $750 million, so maybe we should take a look at this. They were desperate for cash. They needed to close it within like 45 days. and Symbiosis was a well-known quantity to us because we competed with them for disk drive chips. They were doing the same thing we were, selling chips to Seagate, Connor, and we were competing in the SCSI market with them, and they had a fiber channel effort underway. So we said, wow, this is, and they had a RAID business, the NCR RAID business still in Wichita. So we said, this is a big leap forward. It was about the same size company. And so I went to the board and said, let's do it. The board said, okay. So we were first across the threshold with the $750 million check.
And that was, for what it's worth, I believe February 19th, 1998.
Yeah, okay.
That's when the offer was made public.
Right. So we negotiated the deal, and we knew that it was probably going to get antitrust scrutiny, and the FTC won the coin toss with DOJ, and so they started putting us through the ringer. And we hired all the consultants and all the lawyers. And one thing we didn't do, which in retrospect was a big error, because I don't think I had the experience, nor did the board have the experience of how to play the Beltway bandits against the FTC. So we were severely out-lobbied, and the lobbying was done by our friend over at the semiconductor company who bought Symbiosis in the end. And the FTC came down and said, we don't want you to do this. And we had decided beforehand that if we got into a protracted court battle with the FTC, we weren't going to go there. So we terminated the deal. And then LSI Logic bought them.
In June.
Yeah, Wilf Corrigan completely outmaneuvered us in with the Beltway bandits, because we were dealing with FTC staffers which believed that SCSI was going to be the salvation of the universe, and that putting two SCSI companies together was clearly not in the customer's interest. And he said, well, look, here's Intel with I forget what the Intel new I/O subsystem was at the time. There's some name for it that they were going to propose as better than fiber channel, better than SCSI, et cetera, et cetera. So we said, hey, this is all temporal. SCSI is going to go away someday. It's the future of I/O is not all SCSI. SCSI is great. We're going to keep pursuing it. Yeah, we compete, but we both know that because we're investing heavily in fiber channel, that there is a future other than SCSI. So anyway.
So you, as a company, did not then retain Beltway bandits, lobbyists, or did not retain
Not the right
enough?
guys, apparently, or not enough.
Not the right guys, or not enough of them,
Yeah.
or a little bit of both. But you did attempt.
Oh yeah, we had top-notch Washington counsel working on this. But, there's a lot more to it in how you really influence the FTC than lawyering. And we didn't do a good job of that. So we lost that battle. And at that time, things are difficult in terms of the relationship with the investors, because we're now not a momentum company, we're now a value company. Restructured, cut R&D, cut costs, and now we're very profitable company, but we're not growing at high big double-digit numbers. So, and Adler is out agitating against me on Wall Street, actually trying to take over the company. So it gets to be very complicated and messy. And Boucher decides that fiber channel is never going to work, and no company can ever sell disk drives successfully, so we shouldn't be in the RAID business. And so he's leading that charge at the board. And subsequently, I leave. So I retire from Adaptec. But Yeah, when I left, I said to the board, three things. Fiber channel is very important for the future of this company. RAID subsystems can be sold very profitably with disk drives. And if you bring John Adler back, you'll never hire another CEO. Because when the old guy forces out the new guy, everybody's got the message, right? Well, they did all three things. And so the wheels are in motion for Adaptec to die. And it did.
It did.
It did. It's a very sad story.
Did you really think fiber channel was necessary? In retrospect, as you said, fiber channel really hasn't done that. It's a nice niche market.
Yeah, several $100 million of revenue there.
Sure. If you had
the story
50%
told to
share?
me by the Dell sales account guy was Boucher went to Dell and said, "You're crazy. You shouldn't do fiber channel." SCSI's the answer. They had security escort him from the building. So, when a customer says, "Do this," you can give it your best shot, but there's a point where you say, "Yes."
No, I'm just.
And we were long past that point with Dell.
No, if it's a $500 million a year business and you get 20-30% share, that's $150 million, which is nothing to sneeze at. But if you're trying to be a billion-dollar company,
but our goal was, we thought we could get 80%. Right? I mean, why not?
More power to you.
We had in host adapters known in the marketplace. There were OEM chips that Symbio's sold, but we outgunned them completely with the system integrators and retail and the OEMs. So I mean, they had Sun as a customer. That was about it. So, and that's not the PC business.
And your second comment about RAID, do you think that was accurate?
Well, I think so. I mean, look at the number of companies that have been bought for multi-billion dollars in the RAID business in the past 5 years, 10 years. Big numbers. There's, half a dozen that went for multi-billion dollar numbers in terms of when they were sold. So, Dell buys EMC. You can go on and on about who bought whom, right?
I think Intel buying EMC is quite a bit later and quite a different story, but...
Yeah, but the point is there were a number of companies with innovations in RAID businesses that system companies acquired. In some cases, more than one acquisition. I think Hewlett-Packard bought a couple. I have to go look that up, but that's my recollection. So I think, there was a better opportunity than going out of business.
Impossible to dispute that. I understand from you there was a secret sauce at Auspex, at Adaptec.
Right.
Whoa. Talk about a mental slip when you mentioned Larry Boucher.
Right. Well, yeah, the combinatorials, when you start adding up the number of chips and the number of versions of SCSI and the number of system buses, that it's you have to decompose that in some way. And Adaptec had this thing called ASPI, which was kind of that magic sauce that allowed drivers to be easily done and installed on operating systems, because we supported more than just Microsoft, of course. So that ASPI became migrated to Microsoft. It's still there on the driver list, but it's really the Adaptec creation of this middleware, if you will, of software that allows various kinds of complexities to be more easily managed in the development and software installation process. So that was one thing we had. We clearly had the best drivers, the best software support. We had the best warranty. Adaptec had a very deep passion about data integrity. It was basically stop the presses if we discovered problems in a chip that affected data integrity. And occasionally we got caught up in the Intel has a problem in a chip causing data integrity, but we got a non-disclosure, so we can't tell the customers whose problem it really is. But it was our problem.
And you get the blame.
We get the blame. That happened 2 or 3 times over the course of time. So, but I think customers really appreciated the fact that the peripherals and systems really worked when you had an Adaptec controller. That was our cachet. So when you're a system builder, the last thing you want is flaky disk drives or tape drives or CD-ROMs or whatever. So we had a massive number of PCs running all peripherals and operating systems and day and night doing compatibility testing of the combinatorials as well. So that was an important value that the company brought to the customer.
But Microsoft basically co-opted ASPII, as I understand it.
At some point, yes. And I don't know kind of when that happened. If it was on my shift, it might have towards the end, but it was clearly the thing to do as all the drivers moved into the Microsoft world of being automatically installed. Of course, there was a number of versions of Windows where it didn't quite work, but it kind of mostly works now. So
it works, in my experience, amazingly well considering
where
we were in, say, the mid-90s.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Did Adaptec ever get anything for ASPII other than
I don't know.
thanks?
I don't remember. Yeah, could have. Thanks. Dealing with Microsoft was always a pain. The engineers would tell you what wonderful things that they invented that you had done 5 years earlier on your own. So hey, that's the way it was. Got to work with them.
Do you recall any of these shared incidents with Intel where problems were sitting on one side of the interface and you guys were taking the heat for the other side?
I know there are at least 2, because they are memorable. It's the Intel bridge chip. They had a number of, don't ask me the code name of that chip that had the problem, but it did. And so, and I think they might have brought out they might have brought out a PCI bridge chip, which had some problems also. Because I remember I tried to get DEC to license me the DEC PCI bridge chip, which was a really well-engineered chip. It was the gold standard in the industry. But they decided they were going to try to sell it. We were buying them OEM. I said, look, you guys, DEC's in trouble. You guys are never going to make a business out of selling chips. It doesn't fit with DEC. And license me the product. You'll get some licensing revenue. I'll sell the chip. But they wouldn't go for it. So, too bad.
Okay. So you're now have left Adaptec.
Adaptec, right.
I'll get it right. And some of the folks you've acquired are now being laid off or shut down?
Well, yeah, Boucher says we're getting out of the raid business, so we're going to terminate everybody in Longmont. So I said, will you sell me the business or give me the business? Sure, okay. So I found some folks to run it, and that team basically moved over to be Chaparral Network Storage. So we raised some money, mostly small dollars, had a couple of VCs in it. So we moved forward to build RAID subsystems. And that moved forward with 2 CEOs, the founding CEO, and then we hired the COO from SDK to run it.
Who was that?
There's a mind blank. We'll get it.
We'll add it.
We'll get it. And he drove the company forward, found some customers, And we then we decided that we were going to try and sell the company. And the guys in New Jersey, what was the name of the company? You have it, I think.
Dot Hill?
Dot Hill. Dot Hill bought the company. So, it was a transaction that everybody got out alive, and some made money. So it was, I think we were in round E or F when we sold the company. So it was a hard thing to finance, but
It did file an S1. I don't know if it ever went public, but it.
No, yeah, Bear Stearns was trying to take us public, and of course they really wanted to take us public in '98, '99, and I said, well, gee, we hardly have anything to go public on. I said, well, it doesn't matter. We'll take you public. I said, oh, geez, what happens 2 years from now?
Actually, it came up pretty quick. I mean, the S1 showed about $6 million of revenue that first year.
Right.
Which is, from 0 to 6 million is.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
It's impressive.
Right. So we had a real product, and the team continued the product, and Chaparral was sold.
So you were an founding investor, but not a management.
Not an operating person.
Not
right.
an operating
Not an
person.
employee. Right.
And
right.
you were on the board.
Yes. Yeah.
And when the company went to Dot Hill, did you keep any relationship with Dot Hill, or
no?
So,
It was the deal did make the employees mostly whole. We had enough cash coming in that we could basically buy out all the employee options at a reasonable number, not what they would hope for, obviously, but a reasonable number. But they didn't end up with nothing. So the deal was a pretty good deal in the end.
the other parts shut down? ATM, for example. Or
Well, ATM had been shut down by me.
by you.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened on Ethernet. They did sell the disk chip business to TI, I think, sometime later. Some residuals of it.
Okay, that's not particularly.
Right. And of course, in the spring of '98, I also joined the board of Analog Devices back in Boston, and served 17 years with them. So that was another major part of my life.
So again, I have to back up now and ask you the same question about your growth and challenges and what happens when the growth stops, what you've learned from it at Adaptec, if it's anything different than what you learned at DEC.
Well, I guess there's certain things that you look back on and you say, I wish I'd done this or done that. I'd say, like shutting down the disk drive chip business. One thing to do is always look at the core competencies in a team and figure out what they might be able to do with those competencies other than the business you decided not to be in. Typically, sometimes just it's all gone. Now, you have people who, I do disk drive controller chips, I'm never going to do anything else in my life, so they're not part of the new team. But there are competencies, like in serial data, high-performance serial data that we were dealing with, that there are needs out in the world for doing that. So maybe you say, take 10 guys, give them a year, give them $5 million and say, find a new business. Something that's big that can grow. So that's one thing I think you can look at when you transition in and out of businesses is how to preserve some of the value. If you're just getting out, you can sell the business, it's a different whole thing. So, if there's value in it and selling it as an entity, that's another approach. But if you're going to just shut it down, excuse me, maybe there's some more options other than just closing the doors. How hard it is to recover if you miss a technology generation, and clearly Adaptec missing fiber channel and missing RAID. The die was cast. And what are you going to do? How are you ever going to replace that revenue once you fall out of being a leader a very competitive participant in a given market. It's very, very difficult to catch up, maybe impossible. So that was a big mistake, I think, that was made after I left. You go back to DEC and you'd say, the laundry list of mistakes was a little too long for this interview. So
We have time.
well, you really need somebody strategically thinking in a very broad sense about where the industry and the market and the customers are going. And after Gordon Bell, I don't think we had that. At least we didn't have anybody who was willing to forcefully change Ken's prejudices about that. So, the Gordon strategy was fully adopted by engineering, chugging along, worked great until late 80s. And then the customers are different, the marketplace is different, the competitors are different, and the company's not dealing with that. In a way, the whole industry's been tilted on end. We've gone from the vertically integrated systems companies to the layer cake. You got Oracle and Microsoft, and down here we got Intel, and we got some other middleware players. We got Cisco, so it completely de-integrated, and DEC never figured that out. Never dealt with that. Gordon took a sabbatical out in in Silicon Valley one summer, I think before he left, and he said, "Big trouble. This place is where the market, where the customers, and where the industry's headed is not where we're headed." And then he left shortly after that, but it was interesting.
So any other more recent experiences you'd like to put on the record right now? It's not history anymore, but
it's not history.
It'll
right.
be 20 years from now, it'll be history. And your great-grandkids will love to hear you.
Yeah. Well, I'm far enough from the what's really happening in the computer industry that I'd make no forecast or prognostications about it anymore.
Why not?
It would just be fantasy as opposed to any grounding in reality. But I think we've seen it's so complicated in terms of social media versus the cloud. You get this huge range of things going on, and certainly the Computer History Museum is going to try and think about some of those things now. We're thinking more about how to think and help people with what the future ought to be as opposed to what the history was. So not that we're going to make forecasts, but maybe we can help some process around that, provide a forum for that. One of the ideas is, what are the ethics in developing software and running companies? Those are interesting things that we think maybe the industry's gotten some things pretty wrong in the last 5 years. So, I have opinions about that, but I don't know if we have any solutions to that yet.
Okay. Now, if I could ask you to sort of sit up straight and allow my cameraman to zoom in on your face and then on that logo on your shirt. Can you do that for me? While you tell me about your 40 years experience at the Computer History Museum.
Well, it started in Gordon Bell's living room in his house in Lincoln, Massachusetts. He was collecting slide rules and calculators and various artifacts from early computers up through electronic computers. Anyway, there's a move afoot to Ken and Gordon had always been preserving the DEC stuff. So there's a warehouse up in New Hampshire filled with early DEC stuff. And so they decided they're going to have a DEC computer museum, a digital computer museum. in Marlborough in one of the buildings that we bought from RCA. So I volunteered there, and various stuff was on display, including, Ken and Gordon discover that Whirlwind is out in the parking lot ready to be scrapped at MIT. So they said, wow, this is no good, we better save this, because Ken had been a key player in the development of Whirlwind. So their mission becomes saving stuff that people are going to send to the trash man, to the recycler. And they get one of the early computers on the West Coast. It's here in the main exhibit. It was literally in the parking lot at Lockheed, I think. So they start collecting this stuff. That leads to, and I'm kind of volunteer involved, not in any big way. That leads to Gordon's then wife, Gwen, founding the Digital Computer Museum, which was a real public computer museum, not part of DEC, in downtown Boston. And that gets started, and I become an overseer there for a couple of years, one of the terms. And I think has a run, but it gets a little confused in its mission about, is it a science museum for kids, exploratorium kind of thing, or is it a history museum? Meanwhile, Gordon is still personally collecting, and the museum is collecting, so the collection starts expanding greatly back in Boston. They get into trouble financially, never were able to raise any sort of endowment, and basically go out of business. Now, Ken Olson was very nice. He had bought the building for them personally, the mortgage. There was a mortgage, but he put the money in initially, some of the money in initially. So the building is sold, and the proceeds go partially to the Boston Science Museum and a few items of the collection. Prior to that, Gordon had come out here to California. I had moved to California, '92, and we had a West Coast group because Len Shustek, the chairman of the board and the founder of the museum here, had called Gordon one day and said, I want to start a West Coast computer museum, tell me how to do it. So we had a West Coast group of the Boston Digital Computer Museum. Not digital, it was called the Computer Museum. I misspoke there. So Gordon and Len negotiate the collection, of which Gordon personally owns some, comes to Moffett Field, where we had gotten NASA to loan us 3 World War II buildings. And we start having the visible collection. So put things out, put signs on them saying this is a Cray, et cetera. That yields interest, start building a community, and we start trying to raise some money. Some of the directors, the board members now are board members all the way back to Boston, Gardner Henry, myself, Dave House, maybe a couple others. And so we start raising money and intend to build a building because Moffett has got this idea that they're going to become a technology center and lease space to nonprofits and for-profit companies. So I'm the facilities guy and conduct an architectural competition to build a building on Moffett. And we hire EHDD in Seattle to do the architecture. And in the meantime, NASA says, we got to knock down those buildings. So we design a temporary building to put up and actually go out for bids on that. And then the dot bomb happens. And some other nice things happened as a result of the exuberant investment in the stock market. Some folks wrote some big checks. So he said, wow, maybe we ought to rethink our plan. Real estate values are trashed. Building a building is very expensive. Moffitt's looking increasingly dicey because we're dealing with a lot of government regulations and regulators, and that's not so much fun. So we look around, looked at, I don't know, a dozen buildings, and bought this one. Carlyle in New York, the leveraged buyout and investment firm, had owned this building when SGI was in an end-of-the-year cash crunch and sold it in a period of like 3 weeks to Carlyle because they needed $20 million, $22 million. So we say to Carlyle, we want to buy the building. And Donna Dubinsky, Len's wife, spearheads the negotiation with Carlyle, convinces them to sell it to us about what they paid for it. So here we are.
This was the SGI sales and marketing head
Yes.
building?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. They designed it as a general purpose building. They could put engineering in here or whatever they wanted.
My understanding it was sales and marketing.
Yes, it was sales and marketing.
And I figured it out because there's not a single straight line in the building.
Well, SGI was, fairly interested in making things pretty too. So,
True.
they did.
So, what do you think of the museum's mission? Is it doing a good job? Can it improve? What does it do well?
Well, I think we're the foremost collecting and exhibiting computer museum in the world, by far. There's not anybody close. I was in Europe this last spring, and I went to the Deutsches Museum, and as a calibration point, Len and Gardner and I went to the various computer museums in Europe in, when it was it, what year was that? 2000, oh, I know, it was right, it was 2 weeks after 9/11. A date that remembers, caused you remember quite accurately when you were there. And we said, well, Bletchley Park, London Science Museum, Deutsches Museum, Nixdorf Museum, and got a feel for what they were doing. And that helped us set the plan for what we want to do. So, yeah, I think we've done a great job in that core mission of collecting and exhibiting. We've also started some new things. The Entrepreneur Center is great. It's really not specifically computing only, but it is around entrepreneuring in Silicon Valley, and it's got great support. We've got an education wing now. So, I think the museum has grown. It's multifaceted. I think we're really ready to take the next step. That's what Daniel's all about, is taking that next step, raising another big slug of capital money. And we're certainly in the midst of exploring that. We launched the new website here just a few weeks ago. And we're completely rebuilding the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure of the organization. Some things got behind. Those things got behind. And so we're playing catch up in those areas. But I think the plan is a good one moving forward.
I think we are unusual in our emphasis on hardware. A lot of places collect paper, but we do a special job in hardware, I think.
Well, I think that's the history. Yes, one sage said, "Well, we provide a great history of making sheet metal boxes," and yeah, I think that's where we started. Collecting the old. We said, grab the old stuff before it disappears. That's really critical, and that was the initial collecting thrust. I think we've got almost all the old stuff there is to collect. It may be, and there may be some residuals we'd still be able to get, but not many. But then we realized, well, we got to collect software, and so the Shustek Center is about software. And a legacy out of Boston was the explicit decision in Boston to not collect paper. So when the collection and archives came here, there was basically nothing in the way of paper. Minnesota, University of Minnesota, got most of that. Stanford got a lot of that. So we were behind the curve, and that's not the case anymore. We collect paper, we collect bits, we collect software, we collect, you know, we're clearly the leader in bringing old source code to the marketplace. I mean, nobody else has done that. So I think we just announced we got some of Richie's early Unix stuff that was discovered. So that's, you know, we need to be very much more balanced, and I think we are. And I think we need to figure out how to work internationally, how to reach out internationally.
Well, as one of your volunteers, I thank you for the opportunity, because it's been a lot of fun. I guess I've been doing this for a dozen years or so. And then as a member of the SIG, I'd like to thank you for the time you just spent with us today.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting collection, or interesting to collect your perspective on the history of DEC and Adaptec. And
Well, on behalf of the museum, Tom, let me thank you for the huge number of oral histories you've done, too. I mean, you're one of the leaders in making these happen, so thanks very much for making that contribution.